Alright everybody, welcome back. Here we are with part 2 where we will start discussing the list itself. Okay, so let's move on to our first bracket of 10, which is our 100 to 91 range. And that, for those listening, is Mace at 100, Robogeddon at 99, Apex, Evil Weevil, Chronic the Wedgehog, Ripper, Foxic, Tiberius, Pierce de Resistance, and Ironside 3. What are our thoughts? Toast.
He's got me while I'm trying to load the list up.
All right, I'll go first then. To me, the biggest obvious, there's two robots here that would not make the list now. Robogeddon and Apex. Robogeddon, I will put my hand up for, and as soon as somebody made a comment about how Axor had the exact same credibility to make the list, I instantly said I would just take Robogeddon off and put Axor on instead. Now, it has the exact same narrative for it in terms of a robot that has a very memorable loss. I don't agree with the comments that were saying that Splinter is the only memorable trashing victim. I definitely don't agree with that. But I think that if I compare Robogeddon to Axor, who also has two extra fights that are both quite fun in themselves, and then I also take into account how far away down the honourable mentions into the 150, 200 range were Stealth and Robogeddon, and they were not even close, I will own up to the fact that, yeah, I probably wouldn't have Robogeddon now on the list. I don't regret, I think it was fun, and it was a good script, and it had some points for it, and it was representative of a lot of those sort of Series 3 debuts against heavyweights. But, yeah, it probably is one of the ones that shouldn't be on the list.
Yeah, I think it was kind of accepted early on that Axor would just be swallowed up into iron ore, and then we made sure not to mention it in the iron ore just in case it crept on, and then it didn't, and that was just kind of how it was left. Would I say Axor is more iconic than Robogeddon? Yeah, I guess. Would I push for either in the top 100 now? I don't think so. But again, no regrets about including Robogeddon, because even if it's not necessarily correct, it was definitely fun to have it there and highlighted it to a lot of people, which I appreciated.
Yeah. On to Apex. I feel like Apex was definitely came from a lot of our desire to have a reboot robot fairly early on, and obviously the Ape explosion is a big moment in Robot Wars. But we were talking before we started recording. Has enough time passed, and we've sort of realised that's really all Apex has got going for it. I would probably very comfortably leave Apex off now, especially because one of the comments was like, well, we should have Traction because it beat Apex, and the three of us were like, well, I probably wouldn't have Apex now,
Yeah.
so...
No, I think it's one of those where I wouldn't discredit Apex itself for what happens still, but there are more robots in the honourable mentions than I realised initially that I'd now want to put in the list, and Apex would just automatically drop out as a result, really.
Yeah, like if I could drop Robogeddon and Apex and have Chompalot and Corkscrew, I'd be very happy.
Yeah.
Not necessarily in those two spots,
Yeah,
but just
yeah.
as the 100. Yeah. Mace was a really interesting one. So Mace was originally, again, like Beast of Bodmin, was originally up in the 80s, and then we dropped it off the list entirely. And when we were trying to find a 100 to open up the list, we didn't really want to open on Robogeddon or Apex or Evil Weevil. So we thought, let's find something we can slot in at 100 that's perfectly inoffensive, perfectly competent, and will get people watching. And Mace sort of became that robot. And it's a really interesting one because it was higher, and there were quite a few people in the comments suggesting that it should have been higher. But at the same time, there's a lot of people who are saying, gosh, I just really don't remember Mace, and could argue that it could miss. What do we think?
I certainly remember my initial reactions to it being put into the 80s, and I was not a happy bunny about that one. I planned to bring that up as an argument the very next day, as I recall, because it's another one of those Beast of Bodmin ones where objectively it was successful. It had the 2 heat wins out of 2, including a top 8. but look at it as a silhouette, and it's a box. A box with a more notable successor that the team got their real fame for, despite it being so much less successful. And yeah, I just don't think it's a machine that's discussed, even when looking at the early days in particular. I think it is a good opener, but I think 100 for me is the highest it could possibly go.
Nick?
Yeah, I think Toast sums it up pretty well there. It's a machine that I personally like a lot, but again, and as I just said, there are so many robots with a dash of personality or a big moment that didn't make the list, and something like Mace, where its consistency was always its strong point on the show, kind of hinders it in a list like this where it has to stand out more. So I think it's one of those that I'd always like to have in the opening 10 just on paper, but if it came to another 1v1 cut or somebody replacing it, it would have to drop for me.
Alright, so we then also had a couple of controversial, infamous picks in Foxic and Pièce de Resistance. Any thoughts on those two?
Love it. Nah, definitely would keep them. Definitely.
Yeah. I don't think any these ones are more to be discussed but being cut, but they were certainly fun to rank. And when we were discussing, when we got down towards the lower areas of the list and we said, Pièce de Resistance definitely makes the list, and everyone sort of laughed about it.
I
and
had
then we
to
sort of
fight
said, no,
for Foxic a
seriously.
bit, not going to lie about that. I did have to back Foxic's corner for a little while before some of the support came in, which I'm glad happened in the end.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was that reluctance where we know actually the infamy could carry it into the 100. I certainly remember everyone on Twitter just going, they were talking about Foxic way more than anything else in that particular heat.
Yeah.
And then had the comments about how well it could have done in Series 9, the Robo Game stuff, Foxtrot and Predator and BattleBots. It's still around. Like, Foxic is still being discussed.
And obviously you had the comments that Foxic could beat Carbide, and that sort of went on for a while.
Don't remind me.
Classic.
Brilliant stuff.
Ironside 3. So there was some shouts for Ironside 3 to go up. We sort of all agreed that Ironside 3 was a perfect 91, like a good one to wrap up the first bracket of 10. But honestly, I don't think it would go up. Like, if we would... That factor aside, I'm not saying that was the only factor.
So there is a contradiction, really, for me. We punished Ironside 3 a lot for being a reboot robot that wasn't particularly remembered in comparison to the other spinners, other finalists, and it certainly doesn't have the anything going for it outside of the reboot, which is still less widely seen than the classic series. We always wanted to put more priority on the classic series just because it is more known to more people. So putting Ironside low was definitely deliberate. We knew all the way through, even though we were going from 1 to 100 rather than from 100 to 1, Ironside was constantly put off because we knew it was overshadowed in every series it took part in and just inspires very little passion from people despite it finding success. However, then you also look at the same robots of the same caliber, like we had Concussion, who did worse within the same series. We had TR2, who matched its performance in one less series, and they all did a lot better. So I think ultimately either Ironside 3 is too low, or the whole lot of TR2, Concussion, potentially Rapid, as a group, maybe too high. And I'm weirdly more tempted to say it's the latter, I'd probably shift Ironside up a little bit, especially with the knowledge that we didn't have at the time that essentially Ironside 5 was going to compete in BattleBots. That would have helped it, and then it subsequently wouldn't have when the news changed again. But Yeah, that did at least give Ironside a little bit of extra relevance that couldn't factor in when we were doing the ranking. But I'd I'd keep it in the bottom fifth at most, and I'd be more likely to move other reboot robots down.
Yeah, I was going to say I would actually sooner see TR2 come down towards Ironside 3 than Ironside 3 go up towards TR2 because I think it is the most obvious comparison. I think TR2 does get a lot more credit because of obviously it had the undefeated nature and it had the Alex Brown driving thing a lot of people were very passionate about.
And just
So I think
random
TR2
people on Twitter really liking it, which
Yeah.
I never really got.
TR2 is widely more popular than Ironside, but I think that they should be closer, and it would be TR2 going down, not Ironside going up.
Totally.
Yeah, I personally just think they're all in perfectly fine places, to be honest.
Well,
Though,
Nick, this is a review podcast. We
Yeah.
can't just say they're all in perfectly fine places. We need to review.
to be fair, I would swap concussion or not swap directly, but I would change about concussion and rapid because they are 20 spaces apart. Yeah, bang on, and that feels a bit strange. But I'd have TR2 the top of the group and
Yeah.
Ironside 3 the bottom of the group quite comfortably.
Yeah.
And then switch the middle
Yeah.
to about. I don't think there's too much
Like,
to
look
discuss
at-
there though, really.
Look at one-time finalists. I think Thor is probably the most iconic of them all. But in terms of one-time finalists, TR2 probably is the top of that group. And I mean, obviously, Shockwave's at the bottom of the group because they didn't even make the list. But yeah, that's how it sort of feels on that group.
Yeah, I
there.
certainly agree with the order we had them in, just maybe move them closer together. So that's pretty much it for the 90s. I would personally push Chronic and especially Ripper up. Again, Ripper is another one of those who benefited from recent knowledge after it got into BattleBots, after we decided the order, but couldn't have known that. So they're still fine in the 90s, even if I would personally move them. So we can go into the 80s.
Now, the 80s, for those listening, is Something at 90, PP3D, Tsunami, Black Hole, Terror Turtle, Mute, Recyclops, Mousetrap, Scutter's Revenge, and Spawn of Scutter.
It's an interesting range of personalities in here, isn't it?
And it was doing the list like this that made me really enjoy doing the list. Just seeing such a random batch of machines where you've got, like, Spawn of Scutter is the best performing in the UK Championship. You've also got Tsunami is probably the best machine there.
I mean,
And all that sort of
you've got
stuff.
PP3D and Something next to each other when they couldn't be much different in terms of how they
Yeah,
are.
it's so true.
Yeah,
I think we've already talked about Black Hole. I think at this stage, Black Hole's the one who would come off the list altogether at this one.
it is. But that's not to say that Tsunami would go with it.
No,
At the time,
definitely
we
not.
thought it definitely had to be behind Black Hole. You follow up the runner-up with the champion and the European Championship. We maybe argued it carried more weight than Series 7. We wouldn't say so now, and I think Tsunami
Definitely
keeps
not.
its place. We've got that about
Yeah.
where it deserves. It's surrounded
I think
by...
Nick was a bit. There was a bit of gun shyness going on after the reception of Series 7's heat final, placing second on the Ultimate Countdown. I think we were a bit gun shy about putting Tsunami too
that
high.
could have been a factor low-key for sure.
But I think that I would definitely promote Tsunami about 10 spots these days. When you look at who's in the 70s, you've got robots like Cherub. Like, in terms of memorable one-off heat finalists, I think Tsunami and Cherub are pretty close.
Which is so weird to say, but yeah.
Yeah.
So it had Terror Turtles surrounding, and that was definitely my pick as an adored and remembered novelty robot. It appears the sentiment wasn't shared from the reaction, so fair enough, might be. I guess it doesn't really make it, but it was.
I
It was
don't know,
worth a
mate.
shout, I guess.
I think I'd still support you in that one. I like it being where
I think
it
I
is.
would definitely have Terror Turtle, but if we moved Terror Turtle down, the risk then becomes that the 90s are just full of shitbots.
Exactly.
And we wanted to spread it out. Like, I like the idea that something like Mace and Ripper and Tiberius are spreading out amongst your Pierce de Resistances and your Foxix and your Apexes, who are not successful. And so, yeah, I'm just hesitant to say that just because a robot didn't win fights, it needs to go down on the list. Because I have an issue with that.
Oh yeah, totally agree with that. I think it's more just it again came a little too late to be remembered in the same regard as the more famous novelty robots like Granny's Revenge. And
I would honestly just do a straight swap Terra Turtle and something at the moment these days. I think something we could probably swap with Terra Turtle and people would be happier about it.
Yeah, I'd probably swap it with Ripper.
Wow, okay. Now, obviously, the elephant in the room for our discussion, and which was a surprise to me, was the reception to Spawn of Scudder and Scudder's Revenge. I always just thought that they were pretty much the same in terms of, not popularity, I think Spawn of Scudder is definitely more popular, but just in terms of iconic nature, they're just the one-off Scutterbot from series whatever, before Spawn Again. And I was really surprised that Scudder's Revenge got not a negative response, but certainly an overwhelming response. Whereas Spawn of Scudder, there was a bit more consensus that it could probably go a bit higher. We sort of had them back to back in our pool of robots for a very long time, and they sort of just went on together as a back to back. But what do you reckon now?
Yeah, the back to back necessity totally hindered it.
Yeah.
We kind of realised early on as a group. I personally think Spawn of Scudder has the means to go well above Scudder's Revenge, but this doesn't seem to be an argument I'm winning today. I'll agree to keep them together, and I ultimately put more weight in how I don't think Scudder's Revenge was that iconic compared to how I do think Spawn of Scudder was, that they landed together in the 80s, which, as we saw from the fan reception, proved too high for Scudder's Revenge and too low for Spawn of Scudder. And yeah, it does make me wish that we could have broken them up, possibly in my mind excluded Scudder's Revenge altogether and had Spawn of Scudder. I would say probably in the very high 70s or possibly lower 60s, honestly.
Yeah. Well, I look at something Scudder's Revenge
definitely feel too low, but that was a total consequence of keeping it with Scudder's Revenge.
I'm looking for a one-time semi-finalist who fought in an Annihilator that I can compare Spawn of Scudder to and see where that might have
Poor
ranked.
Raging Nightmare.
Raging Nightmare. Well, I mean, Robo Chicken was at 59, and that was not a semi-finalist, but it was a tag team runner-up and a heat finalist, and that got to 59. Obviously, they had more series, so maybe just disregard what I just said there. Tough as Nails, 62, had a side tournament and a UK semi-finalist. I think that, I would probably agree with Spawn of Scudder going up into the low 60s, high 70s.
Yeah.
Probably about where Onslaught is where I'd have it now. I would definitely not drop Scudder's Revenge. I think that the disqualification and the stuff like that is certainly enough, but I think it could probably comfortably sit in like that 90s range or low 80s. High 80s? Yeah, high 80s or 90s
I think
range.
it kind of carries a lot of that Beast of Bodmin and Mace nature, where it was a successful robot in the early days, but without really a key weapon or anything other than its success and kind of the team.
That Beast of Bodmin does.
Yeah,
Beast of Bodmin's got a wink, whereas... Yeah.
I think ultimately it was one of those where we grouped them together because, one of them probably would have got cast adrift completely in the end, if not, and because there were people on both sides of
it's okay to say that I was the only one on Scudder's Revenge's side. You can say it.
No, I mean, I would be as well, but it definitely was one where there were people on either side, and if we weren't careful, one definitely would have got cut adrift, so we kind of just put them together so everyone in our own little group was happy, but I definitely understand the overall reception we got afterwards to it all.
Yeah. I think that, it would have been nice to have the Scudderbots sort of like jumping in groups of 20 or 30. That would have been pretty good, I think. So, yeah, that would have been my call on it now. Moving on to the 70s, we had Cerberus, Berserk 2, Cherub, Ming, Major Tom, Steg 2, Rough Dougal, Millian Bug, Onslaught, and Barbarous.
I think this was definitely one of the weaker segments for the Order in hindsight. It has only one heat winner in the whole group, and that was Steg 2, a single one-off heat winner that went no further. And looking back on that, because we know now, 71 to 80, 81 to 90, that's a video. But we weren't thinking about that at the time of doing the list, and it had relatively no influence. It's only the likes of Ironside 3 and Mace where it actively impacted the placement a little bit. But yeah, this definitely felt like
it was
the
one that we were
weakest group of
dreading the
robots.
premiere of, because I remember saying to Toast, like, oh god, we're going to have an episode where the highlight is Barbarous, and I love Barbarous.
Put these 10 robots into an episode of Robot Wars and Cherub probably wins. Which,
and no one watches. That's the thing. No one would watch this episode. Because you just know Barbarous would lose in the first round.
Millian Bug would pit itself, and...
Yeah. Berserk 2 would try and fight a spinner, and people would find an excuse to give it boost. I feel like, just to go through them one by one, I think we're pretty happy with Barbarous, pretty happy with Steg 2, pretty happy with Ming. I think somebody said Ming should go down, right?
A lot of people discussed Ming. I think there was one or two calls for higher as well, but more so for lower. And
yeah, I think Ming's fine there. Berserk 2 was the weird one. Berserk 2 originally made the list at 62, which, for point of reference, is where Tough as Nails is, until Nick was able to talk us down. Thank God he did, and I would actually drop Berserk 2 a lot lower now.
I'd get rid of it completely. I've been on that train for months and months now.
Yeah, I'd probably put Berserk 2, at best, be like in the low 90s, but the high 90s, sorry.
Yeah. It's a charming little meme that's been made out of it, but it's still a very small group of people that are aware of that meme in itself, and then it has a decent loss, and that's it. I absolutely would not have it at all in the list.
Series 4 and 2 had absolutely no weight on Berserk 2. This, in fact, even Series 3, this was solely because of one fight. And if we're dropping Robogeddon for only having one fight to justify it being on the list, I feel like Berserk 2 at 79 is way too high.
That's not necessarily fair, because it also had the kind of the big cheese appeal of, if this were in a majority of Series 3 heats, it would win them. It just happens to be in a really bad one for it.
I still disagree, though. I mean, people acknowledge it did well against the grand finalists, but I don't really see it talked about in the series as a general thing, whereas the Big Cheese is seen as a really big loss of potential in general.
Yeah. And also, Big Cheese's wins were much more appealing than Berserk 2's. Like, you wouldn't know Berserk 2 won its 2 fights by knockout, because you don't really remember them.
It was being dominated by Alligator until it flipped it over.
Yeah. I see what you're saying, Toast, but I think compared to Big Cheese and Exterminator, it's really not weighed up like those ones are.
For me, I'd be okay for it moving down. I would keep it on the list, but clearly just me for today.
It'd be on the list in a meme way, kind of like we did with Evil Weevil or Pierce the Resistance. So I think the 90s would be a spot for it. Okay, anything else in the 70s that jumps out at us? Oh, the elephant in the room, Rough Dougal. Let's talk about Rough
Yeah,
Dougal.
it's me getting blamed again.
Rough Dougal. Never wanted.
Right, I'll jump in right now and say, yep, this one was my fault. I am one of those many people who grew up with the Robot Wars DVDs And I know I'm not alone on that, much as I'm memed upon for it in this little group of friends. I know those DVDs were a huge factor in many fans growing up, and they helped to make the house robots and the big three, as remembered as they are. They had their own little collections to go back and watch, and the robots that were involved with them, say for example Robogeddon, stuck in the minds even more because they were accessible in that way. I believe it really helped Granny's Revenge as well, because of its involvement in an actually merchandised fight. Rough Dougal, for me, made enough. It was remembered enough because it had only 2 fights, but they were lovingly remembered, and it still stands as one of the most famous and loved joke robots. And then at the time of doing the list, it had a slight bonus where many of us had just been to Robo Nerd, where Rough Dougal was not present, but there was a tribute in a Beetle way, and that alone had the whole venue talking about Rough Dougal again, and people remembering it fondly. That was fresh on my mind at the time, and I let that have a little bit too much influence in the end, and Rough Dougal, by my command, got into the 70s, which was a mistake in hindsight. I would probably still have it in the list, which
me
again,
too.
I'm okay. I'm not alone on it, but yeah, this was probably the most criticised placement in the whole list outside of the top 10, and don't blame you guys.
I don't recall the reception being as negative as I was expected. So as I said before, I was dreading this.
Yeah,
video
it wasn't at the
premiering
time.
because
people
of
were
this
happy
one.
to see it there because people like Rough Dougal. Nobody dislikes it, so it was a welcome surprise. But then when we actually asked for feedback, what was right, what was wrong, Dougal started coming up a couple of times.
Yeah, it really hurts having it above Spawn of Scudder, and even it's right above Steg 2, like immediately
Yeah,
ahead of
Steg 2 is probably the least arguable in the block, and even that shouldn't be above Spawn of Scudder.
Yeah, that's right. So that's that for Rough Dougal. I think I would drop it off completely and wouldn't even have it in the top 110. But yeah, be interested
I
to see
think
what people
Onslaught
think.
probably takes a little tumble for me as well. But
You reckon?
I am surprised having in this area. I'm very surprised no one's ever mentioned Milliam Bug. I really do think that's
I really
too high.
liked Milliam Bug's placement here, but yeah, I agree. I'm surprised there wasn't any calls for it to go lower. Maybe there are opinions on it. Stick them in the chat, guys. We'll be interested. But yeah, interesting one. All right, now let's move on to the 60s section. So in the 60s section, we have at 70 Granny's Revenge, 69 Rapid, 68 Anarchy, then we go into Disco Inferno, Iron Ore, Fluffy, Can Opener, Mini Mega the Morgue, Tough as Nails, and Cat 3 at 61. What is our thought on this section, Toast?
I think there's a strong positive that I'm happy with in the 60s range, and there's the perhaps more glaring negative that I don't see eye to eye with, but certainly to start on the positive, what I do like is that at least from 61 down to 66, I would make very little changes to that order. I think that's still spot on and a good order. The only one that maybe I'd consider moving down a bit would be Mini Mega the Morgue out of those, not based on my own thoughts, but just because that was a recurring thought in the comments. So fair enough, more opinions than just my own. So that could move, but only to the bottom of that group. So generally from Cat 3 right down to Iron Ore, I think those are all in pretty much the right order and worthy of being high on the list. The downside, however, I think that even though they're correct as a group, I think the entire group was too low. And certainly when we look at the 50s range in a few minutes, I would, from Cat 3 all the way down to Iron Ore, I'd pretty much prioritise the entire batch over the next few that follow. But it's up to you guys if you agree, of course.
I definitely agree with that. It's interesting that the cutoff seems to be Iron Ore rather than Disco Inferno, and we'll discuss that in just a second. But I do agree that particularly some like Cat 3 and Can Opener and Iron Ore and Tough as Nails, like that bunch, they definitely feel like they settled a bit too low in the list. But Disco Inferno is an interesting one. So for full disclosure to our listeners, Disco Inferno was accidentally left off the list for a big period of time. I think we got down to about the 80s before we realised we didn't have it. So we sort of round back and we found about some equivalent, spinners / Series 6 Heat finalists to say, right, perfect, it can go in there. And I think that that's about right, but it's interesting that you say that wouldn't move up with that group, Toast. What's your thought process?
Yeah, we definitely made a bit of a like-for-like decision with Fluffy. It was the other big horizontal spinner that had a single episode victory and a trophy to show for it, if indeed Fluffy actually got that trophy.
A Pentagon polycarbonate shell with 2 wheels and painted grey. You'd be forgiven for thinking it's not the same machine.
Exactly. But looking at it more, Fluffy is definitely the more discussed of the two, hence it being higher on the list. We knew that all along. But actually, Fluffy is kind of so much more discussed to the point where actually, Disco Inferno, we've got it close to Fluffy on purpose, but you could also argue that it would be close to Corkscrew on purpose, who is basically at number 101. So I think a more suitable location for Disco Inferno would probably be in the 80s at a guess.
Oh, really? I suppose if you do compare it, rather than Corkscrew, maybe Spikosaurus is also a really good comparison for it in terms of, obviously Disco Inferno has the Heat final that Spikosaurus doesn't, but they do both have an Annihilator trophy and a first round dropout in Series 4. I can see that as the comparison. People do really like Disco Inferno, so maybe I wouldn't be quite that low.
Yeah, maybe low 70s. I need to look in more detail, but I certainly wouldn't be rushing to move Disco Inferno up the list, put it that way.
No.
Nick, what do you think?
I wouldn't move Disco Inferno up either, but I think we've got it in about the right place because the 70s, they're kind of a quirky bunch, and I think Disco Inferno has quite a lot of credibility for its power. It's got a good tournament victory. It's got a Heat final there too. I think it's a really, really solid 67th place if you're looking for specifics, but
yeah, I suppose the number would definitely feel a little bit more spot on once we actually did do the 61 to 66 swap with the ones that follow it.
Yeah, I just definitely don't see myself moving it below the likes of Onslaught or Milliam, Bug or Major Tom. I think it's in a good place.
It's funny, we actually had a commenter whose name I don't have in front of me, but he actually said in his big breakdown that Disco Inferno was in the exact right spot.
Yeah.
And I just found that really funny for a bot that is relatively obscure, like Disco Inferno, to have a spot-on spot at 67.
Yeah,
like
you just think straight off the bat, making this list,
perfect.
Razor first, Hypnodisc and Chaos 2, second and first. It's like, have to make sure Disco Inferno 67th though, lads, okay?
Yeah, shout out to the bot builder for that one. We know it's your favourite robot.
Thank you for that one. That's our validation. The other thing that I want to mention in the 60s is Anarchy. I would push Anarchy down. I think that it's a bit of an IG-88 or one of those really, really well-liked one-time Heat finalists. And I think that the fact that it's the most successful walker and the fact that everyone, it's kind of like a big cheese in the sense that everyone wishes that it was in any other Heat. But 68 seems very high for a robot with only one campaign. Like, even Rapid and Tough as Nails had 2 campaigns. The other campaigns were particularly short, but at least they had 2. Anarchy is just like this one-time bot, and I'm just scrolling down to find... Like, Cherub is a one-time bot, that's at 78. Maybe Anarchy would be better suited in Cherub's company. And Berserk 2 basically is a one-time thing, because no one remembers it for Series 4. I'd probably push Anarchy down about 5 to 7 spots.
Yeah, I'd move it down a handful as well. It gets the notability from being a very competent walker, but in terms of its actual fights, it didn't exactly dominate in the melee, and the Incredible fight, who are you? You're never going to get any real credit for that one. And then, yeah, it loses in the heat final to a respectable opponent, but again, it doesn't have much in the arena to put it in that, because the 60s is already starting to get to a good bracket of machines with good caliber, so Anarchy just feels a little bit high in that type of company.
I'd actually probably say 68's a good spot for Spawn of Scudder. I'd probably put Spawn of Scudder in 68 and then put Anarchy down to about 73 or so, and then just shift everything accordingly, because we were talking about Spawn of Scudder before, and I feel like this is probably, especially if the group above it's taking a jump, Spawn of Scudder is probably pretty good to have here, and that would put it ahead of Steg 2 as well, which is probably, again, more appropriate.
Yeah.
Anyway, so that's good for the 60s. Now let's move on to the 50s, which is the range that Toast wants to analyse as an alternative. So we have 60, we have Eric, 59 Robo Chicken, 58 Kilohertz, 57 Stegosaurus. Then we've got Sabretooth, Big Cheese, Suicidal Tendencies, Crustacean, TR2, and Big Nipper.
Yeah, so I see what was going on here. Clearly we have in the lower 60s that I would suggest moving up, we've got a lot of later series successes that kept the name, even perhaps across the course of the reboot and future discussions, while what we've given more weight to here is definitely successes of the early series. We've got the Big Cheese only in Series 3, Robo Chicken debuting early on, Eric exclusively in Series 3 to 4, but mainly known as an internet meme, Kilohertz exclusively Series 2 to 4, Stegosaurus only Series 3, and I'm certainly not addressing the likes of Big Nipper, TR2, Crustacean and Suicidal Tendencies here. I would keep at least 3 of those roughly where they are, TR2 being the slight exception there. And for me, I think it's always definitely important to prioritise peak Robot Wars viewership where we can, but where this group kind of falls behind, again, is how relevance somewhat faded over time for many of them. Clearly, the Eric meme is finally dead 1 year on. And I must admit, it's kind of its own topic, so I don't know if we're all ready for that, but the one that definitely stings the most for me is the Big Cheese.
Let's just quickly cover off. Let's go through the group. So you're saying basically if the cutoff is the Big Cheese, let's just go through 60 to 55 and we'll finish on the Big Cheese.
Mm-hmm.
So Eric, I think we would all push it down now.
Yeah.
Yep, the Eric meme, remember this list being made in mid-2019? I think everybody sort of said, yeah, Eric's going to have to be high because of the meme, blah, blah, blah. Just want to clarify, none of us think the meme is funny.
No.
There was a few people who go, oh, you've got to be kidding. We're with you guys. We don't like the meme. It's a stupid meme. But we can't deny that the meme exists.
No.
So just want to make that perfectly clear. So, yes, Eric would definitely fall. And I think with the fact that the meme is dying, it would probably be a perfectly good 91 these days, where you discuss it.
Maybe it wouldn't go that far necessarily. It's certainly not been forgotten, but it's the one that's most willing to take a big tumble.
Yeah. Robo Chicken's interesting, because when you say this batch of 5, that sort of, or 6 really, that should tumble down, Robo Chicken's not one that I think of. I suppose that having Robo Chicken over Tough as Nails is the immediate sort of discussion. What do you think, Nick, on that one?
Yeah, I think Robo Chicken here fits in with the handful that are in the 60s that would have moved up. It would just fit in snugly around Cat Free, Tough as Nails, Can Opener and Fluffy. It would kind of find its home in and around there. So,
Would you have it higher or lower than that bunch?
I'd just have it in that group with it. Yeah, I don't think it should outrank them, and obviously Eric splits them apart, but I think it's in about the right place, and probably move it just a couple lower, but that wouldn't be to discredit its own merits as such.
I'd probably put it below Cat 3, but maybe just ahead of Tough as Nails, or even below Tough as Nails, but ahead of Mega Morg. Because, again, I just think that Robo Chicken, it's a combat trophy winner. It was a popular entrant in Series 4, and it did fight all the way through. I don't really agree with Toast's analogy that it's a Series 4 robot. I would really say that Robo Chicken's main popularity came out of Extreme 2 to Series 7.
Well, yeah, of
but
course.
yes, points still taken.
Just difference being all the ones below it did also, the Morga side, they debuted in the later series. Robo Chicken at least had that early series presence. Killatron is next, and that's probably the most difficult.
Killatron.
I've actually done the Jonathan Pierce there, haven't
You have, mate.
I don't know. We moved Killatron down to 58 retroactively, didn't we?
Disgusting. Disgusting.
So it kills, it hurts. Its killer hurts in 58, and that is kind of the hardest one in this group to put anywhere really, because again, it was kind of the unwritten rule of the list to go mainly on UK impact for the sake of fairly excluding the likes of Panzer Mark IV. But then Kilohertz is a machine that only competed in the UK as far as Robot Wars was concerned, but then it gets a huge boost from its appearances in the USA competing in BattleBots. And we can't exactly deny that happened, and clearly with it ranking as high as 58th, I don't think it'd be anywhere near that kind of finishing position without the BattleBots influence.
I'd say the same. I think we've very much Series 4 seeded Kilohertz ourselves in this list.
Yeah, that's right. But the thing is, the show gave prominence to Kilohertz because of the US. That's the thing that's different about your Panzers and your other things like that, is that Kilohertz got more exposure as a result. So even rating it purely on the UK, you can't divorce it from its US performance, because it got the 16th seeding, presumably because of that, and it got extra performances and stuff like that in tournaments and things like that as well. So it's not quite as easy to divorce, but I do agree that it's a bit of a 16th seed thing. And I would honestly say Kilohertz is probably the hardest robot in the entire top 100 to rank.
It is very awkward, yeah. I think it would be one of those machines that would make the 70s a bit more balanced in general.
Yeah,
it would just feel
like Steg 2 range.
Yeah, something like that. There's kind of a few quirky names in and around there, and I think Kilohertz would just smooth it out a little bit. Just one.
Okay. So Stegosaurus is next. Toast, you're the one advocating for this range. Is Stegosaurus one that falls down?
I wouldn't just move Stegosaurus below the robots in the 60s. I'd probably move Stegosaurus below the robots in this area too. And I was uneasy about it making it to 57th in the first place, because although I wasn't watching Robot Wars at the time of 1999 when it was on, I've still seen from friends and live reviewers like Mr. Psycho going through Series 3, people forget that Stegosaurus was taking part even when it was on its path to the grand final. And, as a Robot Wars joint third place, it's clearly worthy of the top 100, but drawing near to the top 50 when it was a one-series robot that got overshadowed every step of the way, no, I would have it probably about
above
where
Granny's Revenge.
Anarchy is. Mm-hmm. Yeah, we've said the same thing in different words, but yeah, about 68-ish.
It's funny you say that, because I definitely agree, because having watched Robot Wars in 1999, like you just said, I actually, when I went to get involved in the wiki in 2009, there was a lot of the robots that I remembered off the top of my head. You had your Chaos 2, Hypnodisc, Razor, Deator, Firestorm, Panic Attack. But I always forgot who the fourth grand finalist in Series 3 was until I got back into the wiki, and I'm like, oh yeah, Stegosaurus. I remember them. Because they have the least memorable Hypnodisc fight. They have the least memorable top 8, fight. They're in a pretty forgettable heat. And then they get immediately replaced by Steg 2. So it is definitely true what you say, and I would definitely agree that I would tumble Steg down about 10 spots. Nick?
Yeah, as I said, I'd move it down to around where Granny's Revenge is. Um, it has its own little fan club. A lot of people appreciate its power for before tornado time, but we have to accept the limitations. And I think its heat is a good moment for it. I think that gets its fair due of praise. But the semi-final battles, the Gravedigger one's seen as controversy against it, if anything. And the Beast of Bodmin fight is one of the most forgettable top 8 fights in Robot Wars, full stop. So, yeah, move it down by about 10 to 12.
Worth mentioning that Stegosaurus, obviously the obvious comparison to Stegosaurus is Killatron and TR2, who are the next grand finalists, and particularly TR2 in terms of one-off joint third places that never competed again. But I think we would also, since we've already said that we would move TR2 down, that sort of supports a Stegosaurus demotion as well. Just giving less weight to one time.
In fact, that probably is how Steg ended up that high in the first place.
Yeah, honestly, I think it was. We were looking for wrapping up anybody who made a top 4, because, correct me if I'm wrong, but is Stegosaurus the lowest ranked robot on the top 100 to make the top 4?
Well, there's Ironside, but that's kind of its own one-off thing.
Yeah, true. Well, again, and you know what? Fair point. Stegosaurus probably is closer to Ironside than it was to TR2 in terms of our minds. All right, let's quickly glance over Sabretooth, because I think Big Cheese is the one we're actually going to discuss.
Yeah, Sabretooth could go literally anywhere. Because
would you... Because you did skip over it when you were listing that group. Would Sabretooth be part of the group that you pushed down for the 60s group?
I would push it down below the 60s group, yes, but no further than that, because it's definitely the outlier in that group that's famous for very different reasons to the others. And yeah, would I call it more iconic than Tough as Nails? No, but I think it's in the right spot out of that group of 5.
Okay, very good. Nick?
I wouldn't move it. I think it's perfect where it is.
Neither would I. I was the one campaigning for Sabretooth to come in at the 50s. I remember Toast was being more reluctant about it, so I think it's fairly safe to say that I'd leave it where it is too. All right, Toast, you got your way. Let's talk about Big Cheese.
Right, the Big Cheese for me in 55th is astonishingly high. I'm still shocked at it, and especially with respect to the fact it was going to be even higher. I had to fight to get it as low as 55th. It was within the top 50 solidly.
Yeah, I think it was like 45 at one point.
Which, to me, I can't get my head around, because it's much like Stegosaurus in that it was notable within Series 3 before being immediately succeeded by something. Except in this case, the Big Cheese didn't win a heat compared to Steg's Grand Final, and while Steg 2 was less notable than Stegosaurus in its own right, Wheelie Big Cheese was one of the most iconic machines of all time. And it just leaves, for me, the Big Cheese almost completely not discussed anymore, because Wheelie Big Cheese totally carried it on. I would not say that the Big Cheese doesn't make the list, because it's very much a different style of combat, and I'm never going to deny that its Series 3 heat was incredibly important. But 55th for the shadow of Wheelie Big Cheese, as it were, from just 3 fights and a distinctive appearance, but one that it shares with a successor, I can't get behind that at all, and I never have.
All right, so to be the other side of the argument, I'll take that case up. I strongly disagree that Big Cheese is in Wheelie Big Cheese's shadow. They are incredibly different machines, and I do think that Big Cheese has got a very widespread appeal outside of being, like Thing 2 or being like Stegosaurus, not Stegosaurus, but like being the predecessor to the robot that everybody knows. I think that the KOs that it did in its 2 fights were very, very well liked. The X factor of it within Series 3, and even today, like on wiki tournaments and fantasy tournaments, people will have Big Cheese beat robots way, way newer and way better than it. And to me, that just shows a lot in favour of it. I will acknowledge that it has perhaps overperformed, and as our man Luke on our podcast did point out, that was probably a little bit of justification and sort of correction of history since Chaos 2 versus Big Cheese was left off the Ultimate Countdown altogether. It probably deserves a little bit of leeway in terms of overperforming to make up for that. And that was probably conscious in a few of our minds in doing this. But I would probably move it below that bunch of 60, but I wouldn't demote it much further than that. I think that it's pretty popular in terms of one-time competitors. Nick?
Yeah, I'd pretty much go along with a similar type of demotion. Definitely too high. Definitely does have its appeal, as opposed to just being overshadowed by Wheelie Big Cheese. But the names directly below it, it doesn't outrank for the comparative longevity or fun factor. So, again, I'd be looking around that Granny's Revenge area. And I think that would be a good spot for it. We acknowledge its strengths, but we don't kind of bloat it a little bit too much. But, yeah, definitely deserves its spot on the list to a solid degree.
Yeah. All right, so let's cover this next batch of 50s. So we've got Suicidal Tendencies, which I think we would all leave where it is. Does anyone have anything controversial on that?
I totally agree.
Not particularly.
No?
I do think it gets a little bit of that extra bit of exposure through the mini-bots and the games.
Video game.
So I think
Where it was
that
the best
helps
robot
it.
in the game.
Yeah, I think if it was gonna be purely on like in-show itself, it probably would have suffered a bit, but I'm not gonna criticise it for the outside things helping it in this case, so yeah, it's fair enough.
Crush Station, I would move up a spot. I reckon that's a top 50 machine nowadays. Series 9 probably hurt it, and that's probably what knocked us out of the top 50, because that was the most recent memory. But I think as time goes on, Crush Station, I do find myself coming back to. I've look at the top 50. Is there anything in there that I'd take out for it? Maybe not.
I
maybe
would
this is
put
where I would stay.
Splinter below it, but
Oh yeah, no, definitely. That's a good call.
I think everything else, it's kind of a little bit of a push. But Splinter, yeah.
TR2, we talked about that one before. I think we will all fairly safely say that it's going to take a demotion for us.
Yeah,
No,
the
I'd
gap
keep it
between
similarly.
TR2 and Ironside 3 hurts a little bit too much. I think they're 40 spaces apart nearly, which
Yeah,
is
39,
a little hard
yeah.
to swallow. But Nick, you disagreed?
Yeah, no, I think it's in about the right place. I know it's a big gap between the two, but for me, TR2 was always competitive in Series 8, always had the appeal of Alex Brown, always had good social media reports and comments on it, whereas Ironside 3 was just kind of seen as, by the more hardcore Robot Wars fans, as a bit robbed in Series 8, and then everyone was happy for it in Series 9, but ultimately didn't really care about it. So I personally think TR2 is perfectly okay. If we were gonna say want to give Crustacean that extra little bit of edge, I think it would be okay, but I wouldn't move TR2 down to try and balance out Ironside 3. I don't really connect the two of those too much.
Yeah, so since we haven't called for comments in a little while, let's have some comments in the chat, if there's a chat going, tell us about your thoughts on the 60s boost, the Big Cheese, and also tell us your thoughts on TR2, because we'd be very interested in those.
Yeah, Concussion's kind of lumped in there with TR2 as well. We definitely wanted to have Concussion higher, but I think if TR2 fell, Concussion would be likely to fall with it. To a lesser degree, perhaps, but they have the same kind of credentials.
Yeah. I think Big Nipper was a perfectly good 51. There was a call for it to go higher. I think that the Big Nipper, we've got to be very careful not to let its live circuit performance, carry too much more weight. For a robot that's only made one heat final in 4 series, I think 51 is very good for it, and it's actually a very good 51 in terms of always banging on like that next level. It's sort of almost a representation for Big Nipper. We know it's capable of that high, but it just at the same time we can't deny that it didn't get it.
Yeah, I
That makes
mean,
sense.
I'd have it as the midpoint exactly at 50. Splinter moves down a few places in general, and I think Big Nipper's the perfect 50 spot of potential, what it did outside the show that holds some weight but not too much that we can put it way, way high, and then it has its moments on the show too, so I think it would be the perfect midway point personally.
All right, guys. Well, with 55 minutes on the clock, we're going to call it there at halfway, and we'll come back for part 3, which will be 50 through to number 1. See you then.